October 1941. The greatest military machine in history turns its gaze toward the ultimate prize. The spires of the Kremlin are no longer a distant dream, but a target on a map. Having devoured Ukraine in the south and laid siege to Leningrad in the north, the Wehrmacht concentrates its fury on the center. Adolf Hitler issues the order for Operation Typhoon. The objective is absolute, not merely to capture the capital, but to erase it from the face of the earth. The scale of the assault is staggering. Nearly 2 million men, 1,000 tanks, and 14,000 artillery pieces align for the final death blow. Facing them is a Red Army that has been bled white. Shattered by the summer disasters, the Soviet defensive lines are thin, brittle, and commanded by men who fear Stalin as much as the Germans. The German plan is a classic double pincer. They aim to encircle the Soviet forces at Vyazma and Bryansk, tearing a hole in the front wide enough to drive a panzer division through sideways. On September 30th, the Typhoon makes landfall. Guderian's Panzer Group 2, fresh from the victory in Kiev, strikes from the south. The Soviet front instantly collapses. Within days, the trap snaps shut at Vyazma. Another 600,000 Soviet soldiers are swallowed whole. It seems history is repeating the disaster of Kiev. The road to Moscow is wide open. There are virtually no reserves left between the German tanks and the capital. Panic begins to ripple through the Kremlin. Berlin is jubilant. The propaganda ministry announces that the war is practically won. The chaotic Russian giant is in its death throes, the newspapers scream. But the Germans have forgotten the calendar. It is mid-October. The golden days of autumn are ending. The skies turn the color of lead. Then the rain begins. Not a shower, but a deluge. The infamous Rasputitsa arrives, the season of bad roads. Overnight, the dusty plains of Russia transform into a sticky, bottomless ocean of mud. It is a glue that defies physics. The Blitzkrieg, built on speed and maneuver, grinds to a halt. Tanks that can smash fortresses are defeated by wet earth. Supply columns stretch for miles, paralyzed. Fuel trucks cannot reach the tanks. Ammunition cannot reach the artillery. The artery of the invasion is clogged. While the Germans fight the mud, Moscow teeters on the brink of anarchy. On October 16th, the Great Panic seizes the capital. Rumors fly that German tanks are already in the suburbs. The government evacuates to Khyberchev. Even the subway stops running, the only day in its history. But one man stays. Stalin decides to remain in the Kremlin. His presence acts as an anchor, preventing total collapse. He recalls his fireman, Georgy Zhukov, from Leningrad. Zhukov finds the defenses in shambles and immediately orders a ruthless reorganization. Not a step back becomes the reality. Desperate measures are taken. Women and children are sent out to dig anti-tank ditches in the freezing rain. The Mazheysk defense line is hastily manned by cadets, militia, and the remnants of shattered units. They are the only shield left. Because the mud has slowed the Germans, Zhukov buys time. Every day the panzers sit stuck is a day the Soviets strengthen their barricades. Yet a new danger lurks in the east. Stalin has hesitated to move the Siberian divisions, fearing a Japanese attack. But a master spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorge, sends a message that changes the war. Japan will not attack. They are moving south. With this intelligence, Stalin releases the Siberian reserves. The white ghosts begin their long journey west. Early November. The temperature drops. The mud begins to harden. The Rasputitsa ends, and the ground becomes solid again. The German High Command breathes a sigh of relief. The tanks can roll. They prepare for the final lunge to capture Moscow before the year ends. But the freeze is a double-edged sword. The mud is gone, but the general winter has arrived early, and the Wehrmacht is still wearing summer uniforms. The supply lines are so overstretched that winter clothing is stuck in Poland. A choice was made, fuel and ammo or coats. They chose fuel. As the final phase of Operation Typhoon begins on November 15th, the Germans are fighting two enemies, the Red Army and the thermometer. November 15th. The ground is now hard as iron. The German engines roar to life, and the final lunge for Moscow begins. The plan is a flight to the front. The German generals know they are racing against time. They must take the city before the true Russian winter arrives. But the Soviet resistance has hardened. Under Zhukov's iron fist, the chaotic retreat has transformed into a stubborn, suicidal defense. At the Duboskovo railway siding, the legend of Panfilov's 28 guardsmen is born. Whether myth or reality, the order is absolute. Russia is vast, but there is nowhere to retreat. Behind us is Moscow. German tanks crush the foxholes, spinning their tracks on the living and the dead. But for every tank destroyed, the German momentum bleeds away. While the soldiers fight in the snow, Stalin orchestrates a masterstroke of psychological warfare. November 7th, the anniversary of the revolution. In a city under siege, with the enemy just miles away, he orders the traditional military parade on Red Square. It is an act of supreme defiance. The world watches in disbelief. These troops do not return to the barracks. They march from the parade, ground directly to the front lines. To the south, Guderian's tanks hit a fortress of their own making, the city of Chala. The workers of the city have turned it into a bastion. Guderian, the master of mobility, is furious. He is forced into a sluggish, frontal slugfest. He lacks the fuel to bypass the city, so he must smash his head against it. By late November, the temperature plunges to -20 degrees Celsius, then -30. The German army is not equipped for this. The Wehrmacht is literally freezing to death. Soldiers have no winter coats, no felt boots, no white camouflage. They are grey spectres against the white snow, perfect targets. The machinery of war begins to fail. The recoil fluid in the artillery guns freezes. The bolts on the rifles jam. To fire a weapon, a soldier must urinate on the mechanism to thaw it. In contrast, the Soviet T-34s, fighting alongside the Siberians, love the cold. Their wide tracks float over the snow, while the narrow German tracks cut deep and get stuck. November 27th. The Germans reach Krasnaya Polyana. They are just 27 kilometers from the Kremlin. German officers can see the city through their binoculars. This is the high water mark of the Wehrmacht. The spires of Moscow become a taunt. They are close enough to see, but too weak to touch. The German infantry strength is down to 30%. Companies are commanded by lieutenants. Battalions are the size of platoons. On December 2nd, a reconnaissance unit of the 2nd Panzer Division penetrates to the town of Khimki. They are 8 kilometers from Moscow. They can see the tram stop. But there are no reserves to follow them. They are a ghost patrol at the end of the world. They are pushed back by a rush of Soviet workers' militia. Field Marshal von Bock calls Berlin. He begs for permission to halt. The troops are finished, he says. We are attacking with the last ounces of strength. Hitler refuses. Attack, he screams. It is a battle of will. He believes that if the Germans are suffering, the Russians must be suffering more. But the golden thread of causality has snapped. Willpower cannot replace oil. Fanaticism cannot replace ammunition. The German army has culminated. Like a rubber band stretched too far, it has lost all elasticity. It hangs limp, vulnerable, and overextended. Meanwhile, behind the Soviet lines, The build-up is complete. The sorcerer, Zhukov, has gathered his strength in secret. 58 divisions, 1,100 tanks, 1.1 million men. The 1st Shark Army, the 20th Army, the 10th Army. They are fresh, warm, and angry. The Germans believe the Red Army is dead. Their intelligence reports say the Russian has no operational reserves left. It is one of the greatest intelligence failures in history. They are not facing a ghost. They are facing a sledgehammer raised to strike. December 5th, 1941. The temperature is minus 30 degrees. The blizzard is howling. The German offensive has officially halted. Then the sky tears open. A terrifying, screeching noise fills the air. The Stalin organs begin to sing. The hunter has become the hunted. The Battle of Moscow is entering its second, bloody act. The Soviet counteroffensive hits the overextended German lines like a tidal wave crashing into a sandcastle. The front does not bend, it shatters. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht is gripped by a sensation they have never known: panic. The hunters are running for their lives. The Siberian divisions are relentless. They appear out of the white mist like ghosts on skis, strike the flanks, and vanish before the Germans can return fire. German engines, frozen solid, refuse to start. The pride of the panzer divisions becomes nothing more than 20-ton steel coffins. To save themselves, German crews torch their own vehicles. The horizon is lit by the pyres of their equipment that was supposed to conquer the world. General Guderian, seeing his army disintegrate, orders a retreat to shorter lines without Hitler's permission. He chooses to save his men, rather than the dictator's ego. But in the wolf's lair, the reaction is volcanic. On December 16th, Hitler issues his infamous halt order. "Stand fast," he commands. "Dig in where you are, burn the villages for warmth, die if you must, but do not retreat." It is a decision of ruthless cruelty, but military historians admit a dark truth. It likely saved the German army from total annihilation. Had they tried to retreat through the snow without fuel, they would have suffered the fate of Napoleon. By standing and fighting, they forced the Soviets to pay for every meter. But the cost is paid in flesh. The temperature drops to minus 45 degrees. Frostbite becomes a more effective killer than the bullet. Medical supplies are frozen. Morphine syrets are hard blocks of ice. Casualties scream as surgeries are performed without anesthesia. German generals who disobey the stand-fast order are purged. Guderian, Hopner, von Brauchitsch, the architects of the Blitzkrieg, are stripped of their commands. Hitler takes personal command of their army. The amateur corporal has fired the professionals. From this point on, the war is his alone to lose. On the Soviet side, the momentum is dizzying. They liberate town after town: Klin, Kalinin, Istra. But as they enter the liberated territories, the euphoria turns to rage. They discover what their occupation has done. The gallows in the town squares, the mass graves, the evidence of executions. This is no longer a war of ideology. It is a war of vengeance. "Kill the German," writes the propagandist Ilya Ehrenberg. "If you kill one, kill another. There is nothing more amusing for us than a heap of German corpses." The Red Army pushes the Wehrmacht back 100, sometimes 250 kilometers. The threat to Moscow is physically removed. But Stalin, drunk on these early successes, makes the same mistake Hitler made. He becomes overconfident. He orders a general offensive across the entire front. He wants to destroy their army group center entirely. Zhukov warns him, "We are stretching too thin." The Soviet logistics, like the Germans before them, begin to fail in the deep snow. The attackers become exhausted. By January 1942, the German hedgehogs, fortified towns turned into strongpoints, begin to hold. The Soviet wave breaks against the rocks. The Battle of Moscow transitions from a dramatic rescue to a grinding, bloody stalemate. The Arzew meat grinder is beginning. But the strategic verdict is already delivered. The Blitzkrieg is dead. The idea of a short war is a fantasy buried in the snow. Germany is now locked in a war of attrition against a giant that has unlimited manpower and industrial capacity. It is a war they mathematically cannot win. In London and Washington, the news from Moscow electrifies the Allies. The Nazi dragon can be wounded. It can be beaten. For the people of Moscow, the immediate terror passes. Their air raid sirens grow less frequent. The trams begin to run again. But the snow around the capital will melt in the spring to reveal a carpet of bones. The defense of the city has cost the Red Army 900,000 casualties. The typhoon has blown itself out, but the storm of World War II is only just beginning. By January 1942, the euphoria of the Soviet counteroffensive begins to fade. The Red Army collides with a new, terrifying reality, the Arzew salient. Hitler looks at the map and sees a pistol pointed at the heart of Moscow. He designates Arzew as the cornerstone of the Eastern Front, ordering the Ninth Army to hold it to the last man. Here, the war transforms from a battle of movement into a horrific reenactment of World War I. Trenches, bunkers, and barbed wire dominate the landscape. The Soviets launch wave after wave of human attacks into this meat grinder. Entire divisions are fed into the machine, only to vanish in the crossfire of German MG-42s. The fighting is so intense that the valley of the Slashivka becomes known simply as the Valley of Death. The snow does not stay white. It turns a churned, dirty grey-red. In the chaos of the Arzew offensive, the Soviet 33rd Army under General Efremov is cut off. They are surrounded behind German lines, starving and freezing. Stalin orders Efremov to hold out, promising rescue. But the rescue never comes. The golden thread of logistics has snapped. In April, wounded and surrounded, General Efremov chooses the final escape. He shoots himself rather than surrender, becoming a martyr of the tragic offensive. While the armies bleed, a shadow war rages in the forests. The partisans, civilians turned soldiers, wreak havoc on the German rear. The symbol of this resistance is an 18-year-old girl, Zoya Kosmodmienskaya. Captured while burning German stables, she is tortured but refuses to break. Her public execution becomes a rallying cry for the entire nation. Stalin orders that the German regiment responsible for her death must never be taken prisoner. The war has become personal. It is no longer about territory. It is about extermination. The rules of war have been buried in the snow. Behind the German lines, the conditions for Soviet POWs spiral into a nightmare that defies description. Open-air cages in -30-degree weather. Starvation leads to madness. Reports of cannibalism reach the desks of commanders on both sides, who turn a blind eye to the horror they have created. As winter drags into March 1942, both giants are exhausted. The Soviet offensive runs out of steam, halted by their own supply limits and German stubbornness. The front line ossifies. It hardens into a jagged scar running across the map of Russia, just 100 miles west of Moscow. Then the seasons turn again. The second Rasputitsa arrives. The spring thaw uncovers the grisly cost of the Battle of Moscow. As the snow melts, the bodies of hundreds of thousands of unburied soldiers emerge. The smell of death replaces the bite of the frost. Disease follows the thaw. Typhus, carried by lice, becomes a second enemy, striking down those who survive the bullets and the cold. Berlin and Moscow both use the pause to reassess. The German Army Group Center has been battered, losing over 500,000 men, but it has not broken. The Battle of Moscow is technically over, but the threat remains. The Wehrmacht is still close enough to launch air raids on the Kremlin. However, Hitler's gaze shifts. He realizes he cannot take Moscow by frontal assault. He turns his eyes south again, toward the oil of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad. Stalin, however, remains convinced that Moscow is still the primary target. He keeps his best armies around the capital, a decision that will have dire consequences in the south. The Germans launch a massive deception campaign, Operation Kremlin, to reinforce Stalin's belief that Moscow is next. But the reality is that the storm has passed. The typhoon has dissipated. Moscow has survived the most dangerous winter in its history. The city becomes a fortress. Anti-aircraft batteries on the roofs, barrage balloons in the sky, and a population hardened by near-death. The Battle of Moscow was the first permanent defeat of the Wehrmacht. It proved that the Blitzkrieg could be stopped. But the cost was astronomical. The Red Army lost nearly as many men defending Moscow as the US and UK lost in the entire war combined. It was a victory purchased with a currency of blood that no other nation could afford to pay. As the spring of 1942 warms the earth, the stage is set for the next act of the tragedy. The road to Berlin begins here at the gates of Moscow. As 1942 dawns, the strategic map has changed forever. The Barbarossa dream of a 4-month campaign is dead, buried under the Russian snow. The Wehrmacht is forced to learn a new, terrible word, Materialschlacht, the war of attrition, a war not of brilliance, but of industrial grinding. The psychological impact on the German soldier is devastating. They were told the Red Army was a colossus with feet of clay. They found it was a beast that refused to die. But the salvation of Moscow triggers a global chain reaction. The golden thread stretches all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Japan, seeing the Germans stall at the gates of Moscow, abandons plans to invade Siberia. Instead, they turn south, striking Pearl Harbor and the British Empire. Had Moscow fallen, Japan might have attacked the Soviet rear. The USSR would have been crushed in a vice. Moscow's defense literally changed the trajectory of World War II. Back in the forests west of Moscow, the war continues in silence. The Arzew salient remains a festering wound that will bleed both armies for another year. It becomes known as the Arzew meat grinder. Stalin demands the destruction of Army Group Center, feeding nearly 2 million casualties into this forgotten battle. But the capital is safe. The immediate threat of annihilation has passed. The factories of Moscow roar back to life, repairing the tanks that defended the city. On May 1st, 1944, the Soviet government creates the Medal for the Defense of Moscow. It is awarded to over 1 million people, soldiers and civilians alike. It honors the teenage girls who dug the trenches, the militia who fought with museum rifles, the traffic controllers who stood at their posts during air raids. The Battle of Moscow also sealed the fate of the German generals. Hitler, distrusting their retreat mentality, takes absolute control. From now on, rigidity replaces flexibility. The German army becomes a robot with a madman at the controls, unable to retreat, unable to adapt. Conversely, the Red Army learns. Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Konev. The school of 1941 was brutal, but the survivors graduated as masters of modern warfare. They learned that tanks must be massed, that artillery must be concentrated, that the infantry must be supported. The road to Berlin is long and bloody. Stalingrad, Kursk, Bagration still lie ahead. But the myth of the master race died in the snowdrifts of Moscow. Today, the battlefield is a place of quiet reflection. The Valakarlamsk highway, once the highway of death, is a commuter route. But if you walk into the woods, the scars are still there. The trenches have slumped but remain visible. The trees still hold the shrapnel in their wood. Searchers still find them. The missing in action. Bones entangled with roots, identifying dog tags corroded by 80 years of soil. They are buried together now. The invaders and the defenders, united by the earth they fought over. The Battle of Moscow serves as a monumental warning to history. It is the graveyard of hubris. It taught the world that no army is invincible, that logistics dictates strategy, that you do not fight Russia in the winter. But above all, it is a testament to the human spirit, to the people who refused to accept the inevitable. Your name is unknown, your deed is immortal. The inscription on the tomb of the unknown soldier in the Alexander Garden. It is where the ashes of a soldier from the Moscow defense line were laid to rest. He represents the hundreds of thousands who never came home. The typhoon raged. It struck the gates. It battered the walls. But the gates held. And because they held, the world was saved from a darkness that sought to extinguish it. The snows of 1941 have long melted, but the memory of the ice remains frozen in time. This was the Battle of Moscow, the turning point, the beginning of their end. Lest we forget.